This story is for the people who overcame hardship to start a new life in a new land. This is for the people who held fast to the American dream. This is for the people who have, through the years, built the traditions we embrace today. This is for you, the heart of Daytons. This is the history of Daytons. Like so many before him and since, Ralph Dayton left his homeland for new opportunities. It was 1639. The English shoemakers settled in New Haven, a colony founded upon the principle of religious freedom. Ralph Dayton later founded the community of East Hampton on Long Island, New York, and his descendants would serve as soldiers in the American Revolution. The Dayton family would make its mark in the New World. One would be the youngest signer of the United States Constitution. The city of Dayton, Ohio, was named for him. Another Dayton founded Hobart College in Geneva, New York. The family also produced another institution, a store that would bear the family name and carry forward its values of hard work, leadership, and service to community and customers. George Draper Dayton never set out to become a merchant. Born in 1857, he was the son of a compassionate doctor, an early opponent of slavery, whose New York home was a stop on the Underground Railway for slaves fleeing to Canada. When he came west to Minnesota at the age of 24, George Draper Dayton was dreaming not of a store, but a bank. In the decades following the Civil War, the upper Midwest was being settled by a tide of European immigrants, German, Scandinavian, and Irish. It was a hard life, but sufficiently full of promise to attract a group of East Coast real estate investors. Impressed by the business acumen of young George Dayton, they sent him to Worthington, Minnesota in 1881 to manage their affairs. George Dayton quickly recognized the opportunities his new situation presented. Within 2 years, he had purchased a bank and moved his wife Emma and their young children to Worthington, where they would remain for 19 years. George Dayton prospered and became a pillar of the community, an elder in the Presbyterian Church, and a tireless advocate of crop diversification among the farmers whose mortgages his bank held. Essentially self-educated, George Dayton had boundless energy and a gift for analyzing economic trends. He had a strong religious faith, a devotion to his family, and a passion for real estate. It was this last interest that attracted him to Minneapolis. Less than 50 years old at the turn of the century, the city's population had grown to 200,000. It was already a bustling center for lumber and wheat. George Dayton, convinced that it was time to diversify his bank's rural holdings with some urban real estate, studied the commercial possibilities in Minneapolis. He sized up the opportunities of a main thoroughfare, standing on various corners of Nicollet Avenue and counting the passers-by. It was market research at its most basic level, and it led George Dayton to select what would one day become the most valuable real estate in the city of Minneapolis. But he built first at 6th and Nicollet, an office building intended for doctors. Construction had already begun when the Panic of 1893 hit. In Worthington, there was a run on the bank, and George Dayton felt compelled to notify his contractors in Minneapolis of his precarious situation. But their faith in George Dayton as a man who paid his debts was steadfast. The bank in Worthington survived, and the building at 6th and Nicollet went up. George Dayton turned his attention to 7th and Nicollet, where Westminster Presbyterian Church had once stood. The church had burned to the ground, and George Dayton bought the property for $165,000. He started building on that site, where Dayton still stands today in 1901, and moved his family to Minneapolis the following year. He brought with him the roll-top desk from his office at the bank and a strong faith in the future of Minneapolis. But the news which would cross his desk was not encouraging. He had bought out the stock of a dry goods company called Goodfellows and set up two partners in business in the new building at the corner of 7th and Nicollet. They called it Goodfellows Daylight Store because of all the windows. They were losing money, and George Dayton had to buy them out to protect his investment. At the age of 45, George Dayton found himself in the retail business, and by the end of 1903, the year he gave the company his name, the store was making money. It would never again end the year in the red. It was a family venture from the start. David Draper Dayton, known as Draper, came to work in the store after graduating from Princeton. He and his father learned the retailing business together. They were determined to sell dependable merchandise at the lowest possible price. Fabrics of all sorts, notions, gloves and hosiery, shoes, clothing, hats, rugs, and draperies. It was to be a business built on integrity and innovation. Many in the community were skeptical about the prospects of this small-town banker and his college-educated son. First of all, the store was too far south. The center of business activity at that time was much closer to the Mississippi River. And they had a formidable competitor in Donaldson's, whose prestigious glass block store, so called because of its windows, had been in business already 20 years. George and Draper Dayton set out to get some attention. An early innovation was this ad for their inventory sale in June of 1903. It was a cumulative ad, a first for the retail trade. It got the city talking and generated traffic for a successful sale. Some of the early Dayton policies about advertising would become long-standing traditions. Unlike its competitors, Dayton's never used superlatives in its ads. The company believed in understatement and the value of favorable word of mouth from customers. More importantly, George Dayton believed an advertisement was a reflection of his own high standards of integrity, a promise of honor upon which customers could rely. The store offered to pay $1 to any customer who could find an inaccuracy in a Dayton's ad. As a result, the company's ads were both read and believed. Just as George Dayton communicated with the public through ads, he communicated with employees through store-wide meetings. From a balcony overlooking the first floor, he would share his plans for the business and offer encouragement to employees assembled below. A company candy kitchen was opened to produce the boxes of sweets George Dayton gave each employee personally as they left the store Christmas Eve. The formation of employee glee clubs, sports teams, and parties was encouraged. The average salary in those days was $5 for a 6-day week. It wasn't unusual to find a personal note from George Dayton tucked into an employee pay envelope. In 1907, the employees organized the Dayton Mutual Benefit Association to provide for each other's families in case of illness or death. Then, as now, customers were highly valued, and the Daytons were determined to win their loyalty through a generous return policy which serves customers to this day. The Panic of 1907 provided another opportunity to win the loyalty of customers. Although the company was advised not to accept checks, ads assured customers that the store was here to accommodate the public and would accept all good checks and issue money orders. So much money came in that Dayton's was able to deposit $25,000 cash in their local bank account to help the bank through the crisis. Dayton's had won the gratitude of its customers and the business community. The store was expanding from the original 3 floors of merchandise to 6. Departments which had been leased to outside companies, including stationery, dressmaking, china and glassware, and a tea room, were absorbed. The Dayton Dry Goods Company was becoming a true department store, and in 1910 changed its name to the Dayton Company. No sooner was a 9-story section completed along 7th Street than another annex was extended to 8th Street. Although it was only 1 story initially, the structure was designed to support as many as 11 more floors. In 1911, George Dayton's second son, Nelson, was persuaded to leave his farm and join the store. And although agriculture remained a lifelong interest, his focus now was the store, and the gentle farmer proved he could be aggressive. The store's blanket department was floundering, unable to make a dent in the competition. Nelson took over and priced everything at cost for 18 months, long enough to establish the business. He shared his father's and brother's competitive spirit and determination to overtake Donaldson's. But the Daytons also knew how to grow through cooperation. Draper helped found the Retail Research Association in 1916. This collaborative group of leading stores across the country, including Hudson's in Detroit, studied challenges facing the retail industry. And again, 2 years later, the Daytons were among the original members of the Associated Merchandising Corporation, or AMC. This group helped member stores establish buying offices in Europe, bringing fresh resources to their customers. Training brought new opportunities to employees. A 3-year in-store educational program called the Commercial School was so successful it became the prototype for the School of Retailing at New York University. 1917 would be a sobering year, both for the store and a country being drawn into what was called the Great War. A disastrous fire in the bitter, cold hours of early morning February 17th forced the store to close for the first time in its history. Shops in the Narragansett parcel at Nicollet and 8th, including Dayton's shoe and silk departments, were incinerated. And although the main store was protected by heavy steel doors, the basement was submerged in 11 feet of water. It was 10 days before the store could reopen, a loss of $500,000. Still, the Daytons found a way to turn even this setback to advantage. Their fire sale attracted so many customers that the doors had to be closed to prevent dangerous overcrowding. At Dayton's, it seemed, anything and everything had the potential to create publicity and goodwill. In 1919, when a handler's strike in New York was holding up deliveries, Dayton's arranged for the first ever air shipment of merchandise, rolling the plane up Hennepin Avenue to the store's door. The flight took a week and cost $2,500 to transport only $6,000 of merchandise. Souvenir seekers snapped up the goods, and Dayton's had made history with the longest commercial flight on record. 84 Dayton's employees went off to the Great War, and those that stayed behind supported them in the war bond drives. Dayton's offered special services. Customers could send their loved ones overseas money and gifts through the store. Or they could order Christmas gifts that Dayton's would buy in Paris and deliver to the soldiers. In 1918, the war ended. The country was in an exuberant mood. So was Dayton's. It was decided to call the sale held in honor of the company's 20th anniversary, Jubilee. Sales were so astounding that even top executives were amazed and asked that the figures be double-checked. Dayton's volume had achieved the goal of surpassing its competitor, Donaldson's. It was 1922. The company also experimented with radio as a way of reaching customers in outlying areas. Dayton's ran its own station for a time in the early 20s. When the company abandoned this effort to professional broadcasters, its equipment was donated to a local technical school. Less spectacular but equally useful efforts were underway inside the store to make life more comfortable for employees. Among the most notable, opening of the company cafeteria on March 1st, 1921. Employees could purchase a hot meal of meat, potato, vegetable, dessert, and coffee for about 26 cents. In 1923, the company lost its most dynamic leader. Draper Dayton, so valuable an executive his father called him 5 men in one, died unexpectedly of what doctors at the time called heart block. He was only 43. Tributes poured forth from the newspapers, the many committees and causes Draper had supported, and his fellow workers, who remembered his inexhaustible energy and goodwill. George Dayton was devastated at the loss of a son and partner and talked of selling the store. But not for long. Nelson Dayton stepped forward to assume his brother's duties. He acted to protect the store from becoming dependent again upon any one leader. Nelson set out to build the strongest team of executives in the department store field. Their goal was to increase volume by creating a store which would be all things to all people. The Dayton's team added departments and services throughout the 20s. The Looking Glass Beauty Parlor to keep customers in the store. A new men's department to lure men in to shop for themselves. A store was opened near the University of Minnesota to build loyalty with customers while they were young. Annual fashion shows were begun at the State Theater. The downstairs store had a growing reputation as a great source of bargains. An extended payment plan was set up for customers on a budget. And J.B. Hudson Jewelers, purchased in 1929, had a glittering array of luxury gift items. By the 20s, Dayton's owned delivery wagons of several types, many drawn by prize-winning horses raised on Nelson Dayton's farm. Customers in the resort communities surrounding Lake Minnetonka could have their packages delivered by a boat dubbed the Daytona. Motorized vehicles began to be used after the First World War, and by 1935, the last of the horses was retired to a life of comfort on Nelson Dayton's farm. There were enough cars on the streets of downtown Minneapolis by the late 20s to cause traffic congestion and parking problems. Dayton's solution? A parking garage directly attached to the store. After this service was added in 1928, shoppers from out of town never had to venture outside or into a competitor's store. But the tenor of the times was about to change. Although the Depression was slower in coming to Minnesota, its effects were nonetheless felt. Because of his reputation as an astute businessman, George Dayton was invited to Washington to report on conditions in the Midwest and advise President Hoover on his Reconstruction Finance Administration. George Dayton's assessment in 1932, things were getting worse. A weary president thanked him for his honesty. Customers were never more interested in bargains. Adopting an aggressive promotional strategy, Dayton's was first to mark down and clear merchandise. A series of one-day events called Bigger Business Days offered incredible bargains to customers, helped manufacturers clear overstock and increase output, and provided extra employment for local residents. Despite the hard times, customers shopped at Dayton's. The store turned a profit every year of the Depression. In fact, careful management made it possible for the company to expand. In 1937, they bought the Narragansett parcel, giving them the entire front on Nicollet between 7th and 8th. An additional $1 million expansion program was announced. 1937 also saw Nelson's son Donald enter the business. Like all family members, he began his career on the selling floor. His cousin George Dayton II had preceded him into the business by 9 years. A third generation of Daytons would build on their grandfather's dream. At the age of 81, never having officially retired from the store, George Draper Dayton died on February 18, 1938. He had created an institution, a store that had become an integral part of the community it served, providing opportunity for employees and customers alike. The Minneapolis Tribune wrote, "He was a good citizen by every test, because he did not live unto himself, but gave spontaneously and served eagerly." The giving continued after his death through the Dayton Foundation. Established by George Dayton in 1918, the foundation supported many worthy causes, including Macalester College in St. Paul and the Minneapolis Institute of Art. The bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941 drew America into the conflict raging in Europe and Asia. Like other American institutions, Dayton's threw itself into the war effort. The rooftop sign on 8th Street was dismantled as part of the national drive to collect the scrap metal needed to produce munitions. The store supported all 7 war loan drives. Normal business would stop at noon for 15 minutes, while Dayton's employees sold war bonds to their customers. Letters and packages went overseas to the 314 employees in the service. 4 of Nelson Dayton's 5 sons served in the war. Only Donald Dayton, who had polio as a child, stayed behind to mind the store. For retailers at home, the challenge was finding enough merchandise to meet demand when so many raw materials were being diverted to the war effort. Dayton's buyers had to be resourceful to procure goods for their customers. In some cases, they purchased raw lumber or textiles and had the desired items made to order. The end of the war was great news for a victorious America and its retailers. A war-weary nation and the returning soldiers were eager to resume normal life, and that included shopping. There was tremendous pent-up demand for durable goods. But the hottest items, coveted by women who had done without, were nylon stockings. Dayton's waited until they had accumulated 60,000 pairs, stored in the sub-basement fur vault for security. And they announced a sale which was to be a huge public relations coup. Some 13,000 people jammed 8th Street the morning of February 7, 1946. 21 policemen and 9 firefighters were on hand to keep the peace. A newspaper columnist called it the Battle of the Nylons. But when it was over, 3 days later, thousands of women had their treasured nylons and a new loyalty to the store which had provided them. Dayton's was determined to provide its growing number of customers with the widest possible selection of goods. More space was needed. In 1946, the store again expanded, raising all but the original structure on 7th and Nicollet to 12 stories. The new Sky Room restaurant on the top floor would float serenely above the city's business district. The Oval Room, patterned after the 28 shop at Marshall Fields, would be an elegant showcase for the kind of couture clothing previously unavailable in Minneapolis. In the executive offices and on the sales floor, the post-war period was dedicated to perfecting the science of retailing. Dayton's was the first AMC merchant to abandon its old central wrapping area. Instead, they pioneered the practice of having packages wrapped by the salesperson at the register. Handling expenses were reduced, and customers found the service more convenient. The store's leadership was in transition as well. The late 40s saw the retirement of a management team dating back to the early 20s. The traditions they had helped build, of course, remained, as did the custom, begun by George Dayton and now continued by Nelson, of personally shaking the hand of every employee to wish them a Merry Christmas. No one knew then that the Christmas of 1947 would be his last at the store. Nelson was losing a fight with cancer. When he died in the spring of 1950, the Minneapolis Tribune mourned the passing of a family man and friend, acknowledging an immense debt to a preeminent citizen. The reins would now pass to a new generation. Donald, Bruce, Wallace, Kenneth, and Douglas. Growing up together on their parents' 700-acre farm at Boulder Bridge on Lake Minnetonka, Nelson's 5 sons absorbed a sense of family pride and responsibility to the community. They had a genuine fondness for each other, and perhaps more importantly for the company, they had complementary skills. It was a team which would continue the traditions begun by their grandfather and add a few of their own. In 1946, they initiated the company's practice of giving to arts and social causes 5% of pre-tax earnings, the maximum allowed by the IRS. They introduced the concept of long-range planning and moved the company from measuring its performance against the previous year to measuring performance against stated goals. They streamlined the operational side of the business, and they promoted growth for both the company and its managers by requiring every executive to groom a backup for that time when he or she moved on to a higher position. Each owned 20% of the business. And in 1950, the brothers had some decisions to make. The retailing landscape was changing. There was growing competition from discount chains. Many independent regional operations like Dayton's had long since been bought up by big national department stores. The brothers believed the one-store operation would be obsolete within 10 years. As Donald explained it, we realized that if we were not going to sell out, then the alternative was just plain go out and do the job right. And that's what the brothers did. They led the company onto the national scene with a strategy of growth. By the early 50s, the baby boom was in full swing. Demographics were changing, and the population was shifting to the suburbs. Dayton's was among the first to recognize this shift and follow the customer. In 1954, the company opened its first branch store in Rochester, Minnesota, just 2 blocks from the world-renowned Mayo Clinic. In recognition of these new customers in outlying areas who might see only a Sunday newspaper, the company changed a long-standing policy and began advertising in the Sunday newspaper in 1954. That same year, ground was broken for what would become the nation's first fully enclosed shopping mall. Many were skeptical that this pasture, 11 miles southwest of downtown, would prove a profitable retail location. But the grand opening of Southdale drew huge crowds of shoppers eager to stroll the garden court and shop in temperature-controlled comfort of a 2-level shopping center anchored by Dayton's and Donaldson's. Expansion continued with the purchase of Schoenemann's in downtown St. Paul in 1957, and eventual construction of a new St. Paul store in 1963. The number of Dayton stores grew in tandem with the Twin Cities metro area. Things were changing in downtown Minneapolis as well. The first Skyway went up in 1962. Donald Dayton was spearheading the $4 million development of the Nicollet Mall, a project which would stimulate more than $200 million in downtown development. Nicollet was the premier retail address in Minneapolis, just as George Draper Dayton had envisioned it at the turn of the century. Meanwhile, Dayton's was gaining a national reputation for its fashion, trend merchandising, and marketing leadership. Dayton's was the first in the country to include African American models in its national advertising. Look magazine's coverage of a 1958 Dayton's fashion show created quite a stir. Company-sponsored radio programs were aimed at young customers, and the company was one of the first to create a young junior area. The company's trend leadership was recognized. Its out-of-sight mod shop garnered national publicity. British supermodel Twiggy was brought in, making Dayton's Minneapolis and St. Paul stores her only stop outside New York. Another innovation was to place accessories and shoes adjacent to related departments. Increasingly, the store sought to bring the merchandise to the customer rather than forcing her to look for it. A willingness to experiment with new ideas was coupled with sound business practices. Inventory was computerized so buyers could track what was selling and ensure a full stock for customers. In 1963, the Minneapolis store had a new venue for hosting its many special events. The 8th floor auditorium was built on the top level of the new parking ramp. It became home to fashion shows, an annual spring flower show, and elaborate holiday displays, many free to the public. The elaborate display windows, a visit to Santa, lunch in the tea room, all of these traditions made Dayton's a part of holiday memories cherished by generations of customers. The Dayton philosophy of being all things to all people soon took new meaning. In 1962, the company responded to the emerging discount market with the opening of the first Target store in Roseville, Minnesota. It quickly became the fastest-growing segment of the business. Reflecting that and other growing businesses, the Dayton Company became Dayton Corporation in 1967, and the brothers became officers of the corporation. Stuart Wells became president of Dayton's department store, the first non-family member to hold that title. That same year, the company went public. A national niche was assured in 1969 when Dayton's joined forces with the J.L. Hudson Company of Detroit to create the Dayton Hudson Corporation. The two stores continued to operate with separate buying groups and central staffs. Recognizing an increasingly diverse workforce, the company worked hard to open up opportunities to more people. An employment opportunity program launched in 1968 earned the company a citation from the National Retail Merchants Association. 1968 also saw the first woman promoted to level of vice president. For the Twin Cities, the 70s were a period of growth, outpacing any other metropolitan area outside the Sun Belt. Dayton's was growing too, expanding into the suburbs and other cities in the region. The company not only weathered the recession of the early 70s, it prospered, and the company continued its tradition of sharing that prosperity with the community, donating to a variety of social and cultural causes in the communities it served. The five Dayton brothers were quietly phasing themselves out of the company, but the family's traditions and values remained. In 1984, Dayton's combined administrative functions with its sister company, Hudson's in Detroit. The new Dayton Hudson Department Store Company had 23,000 employees in 37 stores located in 7 states. And still it grew. The company pursued an aggressive program of store construction and remodeling. The 80s brought new technology, a renewed emphasis on service as a competitive advantage, and marketing innovations such as Santa Bear. Introduced in 1985, he made retail history when he sold out before Thanksgiving, becoming perhaps the most loved and widely copied plush toy ever. In 1990, the purchase of Marshall Field's brought another prestigious name into the Dayton Hudson family. Marshall Field's grew up with the city of Chicago. Like Dayton's and Hudson's, Marshall Field's had long traditions of customer service, fashion leadership, and community involvement. The vision of George Draper Dayton and the values he held dear live on, providing opportunity for thousands of people to pursue their own dreams. Today, the department store division is Dayton's, Hudson's, and Marshall Field's. Over 60 stores in 9 states, each with its own unique personality, but all dedicated to carrying on rich traditions of integrity, leadership, and service to customer and community. There were many who worked and dreamed to build those traditions and write this story. Today, the story is still being written by you. The Heart of Dayton's.